Hi, Misha here, and happy 4th of July. And as always, we have to do a video based on American guns here, or American history, or both. And since the 4th falls on a Sunday, it's a little bit awkward. We are going to be shooting, but won't be able to shoot and publish on the same day, so recording this a couple of days early to give you some tint for the 4th, while we work on some fresh videos. We're going to be revisiting some old favorites, as well as have some new guns to talk about. In this video, I thought we'd just kind of hang out and talk about American handguns. In the past, we've done 4th of July videos on rifles and submachine guns. Yeah, just something. And more importantly, give you kind of a channel update. Talk about what's been going on behind the scenes a wee bit, plans for the future. Maybe finally address about Jay, where he's at, and what we're going to do going forward. So throughout the video, I'll mix it up a bit, both talking about guns and upcoming plans, and just a 4th of July kind of beat the heat hangout. And with that, why don't we do a little bit of fireworks ourselves, Second Amendment style. I think a 1911 Alpha Proj. Can you bump fire that one?
No, not very easily. Nope.
Yep. Mark 25.
Peacock. Fancy. Held open.
Mark 23. M45A1.
Good.
Glock 19X. Sig M17. Apparently I'm supposed to do this at the beginning of the video, not the end, so before we get started, before we jump in, if you could, please like, share, subscribe. You know the drill by now. You're on YouTube. And if you're interested, there's a link to the Patreon page where you can donate $1 or $5 or what have you to support the channel. Yeah, I know it's kind of de rigueur, everyone talks about it, but it really is getting more and more important the way things are trending on YouTube and whatnot. So yeah, if you can support, that'd be great. And with that, let's get into the video. So here on the table, we have my U.S. Service Sidearms. Most of these are GI, a few are more Special Forces. In my personal collection, I tend to go smokeless powder forward, so World War I forward, although I do dive into the late 19th century on occasion. But that means we're starting off with the 1911 from Colt, also World War II production from companies like Ithaca and Remington Rand, and the revolvers that were kind of second line, but also saw a lot of use from the 1917s, which were, of course, 45, up through the 38 specials like the Commando, the Victory, and the post-war Model 10s and 15s. And for decades, these would be the U.S. Service Sidearms. Really wasn't until the 1980s with the Xm9 Trials that the U.S. decided to move away from 45, and 38 for that matter, and go to 9mm, which was the standard in NATO. Of course, that led to the adoption of the Beretta over here, but it had very close competition with the Sig P226 And of course the 228 itself would get adopted as the M11, so we'll talk about that. Of course, here's an updated version, the A1. And then we get into the more modern era where things get interesting. We have the Crew Serve pistol here, which is one of the early polymer frame guns that the U.S. military had, although this was never standard issue, of course. The HK Mark 23. And then, of course, we get into the modern era with the Xm9 Trials, which led to the adoption of the Sig P320 M17. And it would go up against the offering from Glock here, which I've got the 19X. But of course, the 1911 was far from out with the Marines' use of the M45A1. So yeah, we'll just kind of, I don't know, just hang out and talk for a day while everyone is either staying indoors to avoid the heat or recovering from that cookout last night. But yeah, first, a little bit of channel news. We are crossing over into 50,000 subs. It's been a long road because also in this month of July 2021, we're having our 10-year anniversary. Our very first video was published on July 31st, 2011. And I have some special and hopefully fun plans for that video. So stay tuned in just under a month for that. And yeah, I've got quite a few new guns, hopefully to talk about. I'll sprinkle those in throughout this video. But definitely moving forward. In fact, also buying some new equipment. With that, let's talk about the U.S. Army's and Navy's new equipment 100 years ago. The 1911 from John Browning and the Pony Company. Ithaca again. Ithaca. The 1911, really the quintessential American handgun. The Luger is identified with Germany, the Webley with England, the Nambu with Japan if you're worldly, and the 1911 is the American handgun. But it took a long time to actually happen. Here's a Colt made in 1918. Here we have Ithaca. This is a 1911 A1. And here's a Remington Rand 1911 A1. This one's a post-World War II refurb. This one seems to have its World War II finish. The thing was, the U.S. did not just view the handgun, the pistol, as an ornament. It was a combat gun. Another thing, the U.S. military, and this will shock you, was pretty conservative in the late 19th and early 20th century. They wanted revolvers. It really wasn't until the Luger started to make waves, in addition to Colt's own 1903, designed by John Browning, that they started to consider it. They did try out the 1900 model, the 1902, and the early guns were in 38, even though they were self-loading. With the 1905, there was the classic 45 ACP, automatic Colt pistol. This really excited many in the Army, and by this point, the idea of a self-loading gun was starting to get some acceptance. And John Browning had worked with several designs. He tried simple blowback, he tried rotating barrel, but with the 1911 series, he went with the tipping or tilting barrel that worked best. So, trials began in 1906 and lasted for half a decade. 18 companies submitted designs, but in truth, it came down to Savage with their 1907 model, which would be updated, and DWM in Germany with the version of the Luger in 45 ACP. But DWM would drop out before 1909, leaving it to Colt and Savage, and both would go back and forth with Colt kind of always being the favorite, but they kept refining the design on both ends. And by 1911, we have the final Savage of 1911 and the Colt 1911 45 ACP, 5.5-inch barrel. We had all the pretty modern features. Trials, kind of the final run, occurred at the beginning of March, and on March 29, it was pretty much the community was suggesting, yeah, go with the Colt. And in May, they made it official. The U.S. Army was adopting the Colt 1911 as its first automatic service gun. And so production would, of course, commence at Colt, also at Springfield, and eventually Remington UMC as well. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps would adopt it in 1913. And therefore, when World War I began, the armed forces had fewer than 150,000. This was a relatively small military. Remember, the U.S. military before World War I was not the world power we know. It was its own thing. But yeah, they ramped up production in World War I. The early guns had a nice blued finish. Later ones had what they call the Black Army finish here from like 1918. They were contracting with other companies like Winchester and Savage to build more, but the war kind of ended. I mean, America's involvement in the war was less than 2 years. So they really didn't have time to ramp up production. And after the war, the need was less. In fact, it was ordered that the military scale back to under 150,000 full-time personnel. Nevertheless, work with the 1911 would commence in the 1920s, and in 1924, the first of the 1911 A1 changes would appear. Between that time and 1926, there would kind of be a transitional era, and by then you would have the full A1. And the idea, these are minor changes really to improve accuracy, ergonomics. You know the deal for things like we went from the flat mainspring housing to the rounded. We would go to a different shape of the safety. Also, the hammer would be shrunk down a bit. The sights would be enlarged a bit. Grips would go from wood to synthetic, at least eventually. They would add these scallops behind the trigger on the frame. Grip safety was enlarged slightly. Just little ergonomic tweaks. Now this is an Ithaca. And Ithaca was actually the only pre-existing gun maker that received a contract in World War II to build 1911 A1s. There were 5 companies. Colt would continue to build them. But others were like this one here, Remington Rand, which wasn't a gun company. You notice this one has a checkered mainspring housing. I did a video last year on the different 1911 A1 changes. The military had only about 140,000 1911s in inventory before World War II, so that's why they had to ramp up production. Now, before, during World War I period, they had fewer than 1 million, about 900,000. In World War II, they would build close to 2 million. And they would end production with the war in 1945, again canceling outstanding contracts because they didn't need them. So total production in the U.S., you're looking at about 2,700,000 to 2,800,000. And that was enough to equip the Army and many in the Navy and Air Force and Marine Corps for decades to come. That's why many just ended up getting refurbished, like this gun here, used throughout Korea and Vietnam. Simple and dependable for what it was. For an early automatic, it was very durable. The U.S. put this through some heavy testing, 6,000 round endurance test. They did their best to give it good sights. They also really were concerned with safety, hence the grip safety and the manual safety. For accuracy, it has a 5.5-inch barrel. So from the beginning, the U.S. held its automatics to a very high standard, and we see that here. And that's why it took them so long to finally adopt one. But of course, once the 1911 was adopted, it's a classic. You know the deal. And we can always do a full video on it. So this was, the standard service gun for all the branches for decades upon decades, even though they really didn't make new ones after 1945. As far as channel news to kind of go alongside this, we are planning to have some fun. We're working on videos. Yes, we are working with the new Zastava M90, the 223 AK. That should be great. And I did get my hands on an HK SP5, and I'm working on comparing it, shooting it up against the POF5 and the MKE, the Z5. So for roller lock fans, that should be something neat. And get my hands on a new production PSL, and working with kind of comparing that to my older one. And we do have a few surprises coming that I don't want to spoil at the moment. I will say that we are working with the Fox Gen 2, kind of comparing it to the Gen 1, mostly because I just really like talking about the Fox and Polish guns, because they are cool. And there might be one or two new Swiss guns. We mention them from time to time around here. And with that, let's talk about revolvers. Alpha Pride. And when you're talking American revolvers, there has been a rivalry between Colt and Smith & Wesson forever. And with the 1917 model here, it's no different. The U.S. did not have enough 1911s. It was not really ready for World War I. It did have a few 1903s and 32 in inventory, but that really wasn't worth anything. And every manufacturer of firearms was busy. They had contracts for rifles or machine guns or what have you, even just gear. But revolvers were still a trusted thing. In fact, while they were waiting on the 1911 trials to be over, the Army had ordered a few thousand Colt new service. I think it was the 1909 model, chambered in .45 long Colt. So in 1915, it was pretty easy, since the production line was still there with the large frame, so-called new service, to just rework it to fire .45 ACP. Colt had already had a contract with the British to produce one in .455. So 5.5-inch barrel, 6-shot cylinder, and Colt's standard pull to swing out with ejector. Notice how there's no lug under the barrel for the end of the ejector. Of course, it is double, single action. Smith & Wesson, meanwhile, had its own production line for what they called the hand ejector. And in my opinion, this is a little bit more of a refined design, also known as the end frame later on. It has a push-in swing out for the cylinder, and it has a lug under the barrel to protect the end of the rod. Something else Smith & Wesson contributed, they came up with the moon clip and half moon clip design so that .45 ACP, which is a recessed rim or rimless round, could be used in a revolver, because otherwise a revolver kind of needs a rim to work. So what they did, they would use the moon clips. Also, Smith & Wesson would put a lip or an edge in the cylinder so that you could put loose 45 ACP rounds in there and still shoot them. Now, ejecting them, you couldn't do, but you could poke them out with a stick. The first Colt 1917s did not have this lip or ledge inside the cylinder, but after about 50,000 had been built, they would add it, because it's a really good idea. And since these were traditional technology, they had the production line, they had the know-how at the factory to build them, they were able to crank these out in pretty good numbers. Roughly speaking, about 151,000 Colt 1917s and 153,000 Smith & Wesson 1917s were built, meaning the military got their hands on roughly 300,000. At Colt, production would run through the end of 1918, and at Smith they would keep building them through about 1919. And these were supplemental to the 1911, firing the same ammo, and just gave them something else to manage. Now, while production was not underway for the U.S. government after this time, they were still kept in inventory, and in fact, before World War II, they had roughly 96,000 Colts still around, and about 91,000 Smiths. Now, some of these, 20 or 30,000, were given away as Lend-Lease, but the rest were kind of kept around in inventory to equip second-line units or like guards. Many of them were given plastic grips for refurbishment, and the bluing was replaced with phosphating. But the 1917 certainly served in World War II. But after that, it was pretty much declared obsolete because they had plenty of 1911s to do the deed. And with that, yeah, other stuff we're working on here. I'm actually trying it out right now. Picked up a new microphone. The old Wi-Fi or wireless mic was a really good set for the money. Served well for 4 or 5 years. But the lav mic part needed replacing. Its battery life was okay, a few hours, but not great. Range was okay. And I thought, why not buy something good? And at first I thought, just kind of upgrade kind of the medium. But then I got to talking with people, and a friend who's helping me now suggested this Sennheiser. And while it is kind of the high end of things, it seems to be working out pretty well. And I have to give thanks. I used Patreon money to buy it. Also money from supporters who bought the Swiss guns from me lately, from Ozark Bear Arms. I'm trying to use the profits from those sales to benefit and not just blow the money. So I'm trying to improve the channel. We also have picked up a couple of new tripods. And might even pick up a separate camera at some point and some additional lighting. And I'll probably end up more in front of the camera like it used to be versus doing it like this as we've had to do because of, 2020, COVID, and how everything kind of sucked for a while there. But trying to get back on track, improving the quality of hopefully everything. So I hope it's worth it. I'm trying to do it for you guys because I really do appreciate you all. Again, we're coming up on 50,000 folks, and it's been a long road, but hopefully we can kind of build some momentum here because I really love doing these videos and talking about firearms and history. So I really hope you do too. And with that, let's talk about some more history and some more wheel guns. Alpha Proj with 38 this time.
Sights are definitely on with the 38 more than the 357. Clear?
Even though more and more factories were producing the 1911 A1 in increasing numbers throughout World War II, yet again, the U.S. military did not have enough. And thus we get more revolvers. We have the Smith & Wesson so-called Victory and the lesser-known Colt Commando. Now, unlike their big brothers, which are in 45 ACP. These are in 38 Special because they were mostly procured for second-line units or self-defense, not so much offense. And that's just kind of how the 1930s had played out. Police officers and private detectives and all that had carried 38s, and 38 Special was a little better than the old-school 38s. Either way, that's what they did. Yet again, they were contracted to build these to supplement. The Victory here is based on Smith & Wesson's M&P, Military and Police, which itself is an evolution of the hand ejector. And the first ones were actually just M&Ps off the production line. Later, in 1942, they would go to a phosphate finish with the slab wood grips. Still 6-shot cylinder, double action, single action trigger, lanyard loop. You know the drill. Colt would also be contracted to make a version of its official service gun. You know, kind of based around the whole police positive thing. There's a lot of 38 Colts from this era. But unfortunately, Colt was a little slow to produce them. So in 1942, essentially the government, or the DSC, ordered them to ramp up production, speed it up. So they made some simplifications, removed some checkering. They went to kind of a blasted matte blued finish. They went to plastic synthetic grips. Yet they never really produced these in numbers. Smith & Wesson made a ton of Victory models. The Victory name came when they hit serial number 1 million. They rolled over and added a V, and that's where it really started. And while many were produced for the U.S., many were also produced for its allies. The Army kind of got dibs on its 1911s. So that left the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, and certainly the Coast Guard, not to mention facility security like, plant guards and things in the U.S., and the military police needing guns. So they often got Victory model Smith & Wessons. Now, originally, there was a problem with the safety. One was dropped and a sailor was killed on board a ship. So in 1944, yet again, they kind of pressured Colt, hey, we need a good revolver, make more. But it didn't happen. Colt never could produce enough commandos because they were focusing on their 1911 A1 line. Smith & Wesson was free. They very quickly fixed, giving it a firing pin safety. This is the VS mark you can see on these. And so they continued with the Victory model. The U.S. would have over 350,000 victories by the end of the war, and only 50,000 Colt Commandos would be built. And of these, many were not even used by the U.S. military. They were just either in government stocks or given away to allies. So that's why the Colt is just lesser known. In the Navy and the Marine Corps, these were not only carried on board ships, but they were actually very popular with flyers. They were considered light. They had a 4-inch barrel as standard, although some were either made or cut down to 2. And they were just considered safer than carrying a 1911, especially with one in the tube. The same can be said for the U.S. Army Air Corps, later U.S. Army Air Forces during the war. They too often preferred a 38 caliber revolver to carry on the pilot in case of ejection or whatnot. Again, self-defense weapons, so compactness and safety were more important than lethality. But of course, some still carried the 1911. These are very equal as far as features and quality, but again, I just find the Smith design to be a little more elegant. I like the lug. I like the cylinder latch. Personal preference. The last Colts were delivered in February of 45, and the last Victories around August. But they were kept in service, especially the Victories, for years to come. In fact, right as Smith & Wesson stopped delivering new Victories, a program was started to refurbish them. and continue to issue them. And this would run through at least the 1950s. And so these little 38s would remain in inventory for years to come. And they're often overlooked today, but I've always thought they were a neat piece of history. And speaking of, this channel, some jokingly say it is kind of boring and slow, and I get that. But I really do like showing off not just the big things. I mean, the big, better equipped channels can talk about the latest Glock or AR-15. I really enjoy bringing to you lesser known guns. And I understand that's definitely a niche market. And my style is certainly niche because I was a teacher. This is kind of a teaching format. So if you're interested, I appreciate it. If not, no worries. Maybe the next video will be to your liking. I do try to diversify, having some old versus new guns, AKs, ARs, HKs. So I do try to diversify and will continue to do so into the future. And speaking of, the 38 would continue in the U.S. military. Half a proj, 38.
Gonna mag dump with 357.
He's got his bump fire on. It's just barely New York legal. Up to this point, all the guns you've looked at, hopefully I've got on camera, have been military surplus. This one here is not, although it is correct. This is a Smith & Wesson S&W model 15-2, known in the military as the M15. In 1947, the Air Force became its own independent branch, and it really gravitated towards the revolver. And actually would become a standard issue. They had plenty of Victory models. They also, post-war, would purchase some Model 10s from Smith & Wesson, as well as some Model 12s, which would become the Air Crewman. Well, technically, Air Crewman became the Model 12. You know what I mean. And they would continue to issue these in Vietnam. Some to flyers and helicopter pilots, that's very common, but also base guards and what have you. And some would be carried by tunnel rats as well. So the 38 would continue on, and they would purchase quite a large number of the 15-2 from Smith & Wesson, pretty much off-the-shelf guns, just given Air Force stamping and whatnot. Some would be phosphated as they were refurbished. And this is the same as a Model 10, except it has fancier sights. And of course, since it's a commercial gun, it has fancier checkering. But the Air Force would continue using mostly 38s, kind of a hodgepodge of slightly different ones, through the 1970s. And actually, they would still have some in inventory in the 80s, and there would be some in the reserves even into the 90s, believe it or not. So that's kind of fun. But again, since they were flying planes, they didn't have quite the need that, say, the Army or the Marine Corps, perhaps even the Navy, had. So they needed, again, something more of a defensive gun that was just dependable. And they're still relying on 38 Special. But that does kind of lead in to what would come next. Didn't held open, but empty. Of course, we get to the Xm9 Trials, and I don't want to ramble on too much here. Again, this is just a fun 4th of July video. But it is worth saying that it did start off with the Air Force. In the 70s, committees were established, and the U.S. determined that it wanted to standardize with NATO using 9x19, replacing aging 45. So by 1980, that was decided, and the Air Force had its first round of trials. And Beretta submitted the 92S-1 variant, and the Air Force selected it over entries from Colt, Smith & Wesson, and a couple of others. So it was all set to adopt the 92S, But the Army protested, and then it got involved and did its own trials, known as the Xm9 Trials. And they drug out well through 1984, with everyone under the sun submitting designs. Beretta would first have the 92 SB, the 92 SBF. This would evolve into the 92F, which was adopted to finally replace the classic 1911 towards the beginning of 1985. And this was to be a joint services handgun to be used by Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. But not everyone played ball. Its number one competitor, really, was from Sig Sauer. It took its basic apologies for that. As I was saying, it took its basic P220 design and scaled it up and modified it to meet the terms of the Xm9 Trials, producing the P226 that we know today. And so this was kind of the main deal, and this is pretty famously known. Both would pass the trials, and the Beretta was selected for more economical reasons. And much like with the 1911, these were very intense, very drawn-out trials, really taking about the same time as the 1911s. Even now, in the 1980s, that is, the U.S. was viewing this as a combat gun, not a status symbol. And it received criticism, but the truth be told, it was the right move to go from 45 to 9mm, because the advantages simply outweigh the disadvantages. You get double the capacity, a lighter gun, better accuracy, and by that I mean it's easier to train 18-year-olds how to shoot it. It was a very reliable gun. The Beretta uses the tilting wedge system. For that matter, the Sig uses a tilting barrel system, just a linkless design, but very much inspired and modified from John Browning's original. Lower felt recoil, yada yada. You get the idea. Well, so the 92F was adopted as the M9. Still, there were protests. So in 1988, you had the Xm10 Trials. And Beretta submitted the 92FS, which had a safety feature in case the slide cracked or flew off, that it would be caught by the gun. That's because there were a handful of reports of that happening, all with the Italian steel. Beretta blamed the ammo being used, which was subpar, but really the metal in the slides were subpar too. Kind of a, stacking of issues. But once they went to American production of the M9, this never repeated. And to be fair, it only happened 3 times in the field in the 80s during testing. So yet again, the 92FS would win out the Xm10 trials, and that would become the new M9 standard. And thus, by 1990, this was in full swing production and was ready to go. Now this gun here, they don't have military surplus M9s. This was a commemorative edition and released in 95 to celebrate 10 years. Beretta's made the most out of these. They've continued to have contracts up, through 2017 when it was finally replaced. And by and large, most soldiers, liked it, and some are still in service even today. Again, that's a kind of a topic for a wholly different video. As for the P226, its days weren't over either. This one here is the Sig Sauer Special Edition Mark 25, used by the Navy SEALs, hence why it has the anchor. So Special Forces units would select the 226, the full-size version. But maybe more importantly, the 228, the compact version with the barrel about 3.9 inches and a slightly shorter grip, would see success. First, in 1989, the Navy would just buy some as 228s, but then in 1991-92, after the Gulf War, there were the Xm9 Trials, and this was to adopt a compact gun for carry by military police, some pilots, JAG officers, what have you, kind of replacing older small automatics they had and some revolvers still hanging out in the Air Force. So the 228 in 1993 was adopted as the M11, the compact version. And those were also in service until quite recently, when they were replaced by the M18, but we'll get to that in a minute. And they would have several thousand, and yet they would be used by multiple branches. You don't hear much about the M11, and I wish I had one to show you right now. There were a handful of X guns that were remarked as M11Bs sold, but those are, I don't have one. Kind of wish I did. I don't have everything, though. And that's something else to kind of mention as far as private talk. The guns here in this channel, some are mine. Many are loaned to me by friends who just want to contribute, so we have a lot of gratitude towards them. A lot of those people want to be anonymous, but some like to be mentioned. Others come from a few manufacturers that have helped me out, for example, Atlantic Firearms. But yeah, all in all, pretty well supported by Patreon and you guys, because I don't really have ammo sponsorships. Don't really want them. Too small anyway for that. And I don't get free T&E guns. At the very least, a lot of the guns here are store guns that later get sold. So this is still very much a small channel and small gun shop, and to a lot of extent I like it that way. It gives me a lot of flexibility as to what's going on. But Patreon has been a big help, and the only reason we really did that was because people insisted on it. People kept wanting to give us money. But it really has, especially because YouTube is its own thing and there's no money there, especially for gun channels. And with that, I guess it is time to address what about Jay? At least right after our next little gun snippet. M45A1. M45A1. Open. Well, the M9 kind of had its full debut in the Gulf War, 1991. And throughout the 90s, Special Forces, SOCOM, MARSOC, MUSOC, and the like were gaining more and more funding. And one of the first kind of specialized pistols developed for them was the crew-served pistol here, the Heckler & Koch Mark 23 Motto. And I've done a video or two on this. We can definitely revisit it. First off, it shows that 45 was still being used even after the adoption of 9, because it is chambered for 45. It was also built to work with a sound suppressor, as well as designator laser. And it was one of the first, if not the first, perhaps, polymer-framed gun to be adopted, at least approved, for the military. Now, this was never standard, obviously. Only a few were even really acquired. But it was in the inventory of Special Forces, much like that Mark 25 was in the inventory of the SEALs we just looked at. Specialist gun, meant to be an offensive pistol, 12-round mag, so near double the capacity of a 1911. This thing was built tough, even though it was Special Forces. My God, these things can take a licking. And it was just a special acquirement. And it's so big, it is ridiculous. I love it. Or maybe I love it to hate it. I don't know. It's so weird and cool. Obviously, this is, again, not a military gun, because I don't think they've ever surplused them and never will. But HK has made them available on the commercial market from time to time. And this really was one of the first specialist pistols, because it was developed for the U.S. Special Forces Command, and would lead to the whole USP series and the HK-45 series. Likewise, Beretta would modify the M9 over time, and in 2006, the military, I believe it was mostly the Marines, would first order the M9A1 here. Now the big difference, it has a single slot pick rail under the barrel. It also had typical modern M9 features like the polymer guide rod, which many think was a cost savings measure. No, it really actually is better, especially for places like the desert, because obviously by 2006, we're in the war on terror. Afghanistan, sure, but Iraq, and this was kind of in response to that. It had a few other changes, like different checkering on the back strap and front strap, slightly reshaped trigger guard, mostly to work with the rail. It had new mags that were PVD coated for resistance. In fact, PVD coating would start to become a very popular feature. And as you see on mine, it has laser grips. And these are actually mil-spec laser grips. And those would appear on regular M9s as well. Now, they never acquired hundreds of thousands of M9A1s, but it was the one major update improvement on the M9 that was approved for special purpose type service. Again, the M9 was still standard, but that was there. And likewise, we come to another one. The U.S. Marine Corps' M45A1. The U.S. Marine Corps really held on to the 1911 and the 45 cartridge. The Navy, while it preferred the P226, at least kind of went with 9mm. But the Marines, they liked their old schoolness. And their custom shop was modifying old 1911s and 1911A1s that dated all the way back, oh lordy, even World War I in some frames cases, World War II. Remember, the last new 1911 frames were received in 1945. They were customizing these up through the 90s and early 2000s as the M45. But with the war on terror, they needed more than they could produce and rebuild, plus the old frames were just wearing out completely. So around 2010, this whole project began, and Colt was awarded a contract, and they were delivered between 2012 and 2016, and they would get about 12,000, give or take. Pretty large number. These were used by Mishaco and MARSOC, as well as SOCOM, so not the rank-and-file Marines. And the higher-ups, the generals, the colonels, the old boys, loved it. It's a 1911. It's got the Series 80 safety for safety. It has the old flat mainspring housing again, like the original. It has a bulge on the safety. Reworked Novak night sights, ambidextrous safety. Has a full Picatinny rail under the barrel with multiple slots. It's got G10 grips, which I really do like. And it's got modern coated magazines from Wesson, the 47 mags. So, it's a 1911. It's about as modern as you could get it while still having mil-spec toughness. That's why it doesn't have a super light trigger safety. So the old boys loved it. Unfortunately, they started putting it in the hands of young kids, because guess what? Special forces are not made up of 40 and 50-year-olds. It's guys in their early 20s, maybe late 20s and early 30s if they're really good. They didn't like it. At least most of them didn't. It's heavy, single action only, 7 to 8 shot mag, harder to shoot accurately, uses lower velocity ammo. It really showed that while the 1911 was a great gun 100 years earlier, its day had come and gone. In fact, as I said in the last time I did a full video on this, it'd be like if someone tried to make a Luger in the 21st century for actual military use. It's kind of a ridiculous concept. So even as the Colt was still delivering the last of these, the Marine Corps in 2015 authorized users to carry a Glock 19 instead if they preferred, and most did. So about the time that the last of these were being delivered, they were being pulled out. They also had trouble with the finish. Colt would fix it. They would go from Cerakote to kind of an ion bonded coating. But either way, some are still in service, but many were pulled out. In fact, some of the older ones were sold off as surplus a few years ago. This one was bought new from Colt, but it is one of the military production ones, not the custom shop reworked ones. And I like it for what it is. It didn't cost an arm and a leg, truth be told. I bought it on a pretty deep discount where it was only a little over $1,000. I like having a modern shooter 1911 because I don't like shooting my World War II guns. And the recoil spring is nice. And we actually did a 4th of July video with this 7 years ago. And with that, let's talk about Jay. Now, I haven't really mentioned much about it here because I wanted to leave the door open. As you know, we had a lot happening to us in February and March, including him getting a new job, which was good. It was definitely a promoted up. And he wasn't sure how many hours he would have left for the channel. And so I didn't want to say he has stepped away in case he just needed a few weeks or a month to come back. But now it's been 4 months, and he's done one video, which I know for a fact he actually recorded before March, that was on his PE90. So I didn't want to say anything because he might have just wanted to come right back in. Cool. On the other hand, I didn't want him to feel pressured or obligated. I also think his interests have diverged from guns a bit. He's really getting into swords and knives, which is awesome. And he really wasn't fond of the politics, and I think the HD18 scandal really pushed him over the edge, based on conversations we had. Either way, he's not committed here. He's not under contract. You know, when this channel first started, you got me. I actually asked him for years to kind of come on board because I thought people would enjoy hearing from someone else besides me. And then a few years ago, he did start joining in, which I think we all enjoyed. But now life just doesn't allow him the time, and I don't think his interest is really there. So with that, he has stepped away. That's not to say he might not make a guest appearance or even come back in full 6 months or a year or 2 years later. I don't know. What I can tell you, no ill words at all were spoken. There was no fight. There was no falling out, professionally or privately. Nothing like that. No juicy scandal, guys. It's just, you know, life kind of brought us both together about 11 years ago because of a mutual thing of guns. But situations change. Life changes, and guns are no longer something he really has the time to devote, and thus the channel. But I know perfectly well I can't do this on my own. I can't video edit. I can't see. So the good news is I've actually been working with several people over the last few months, and it will be kind of an ensemble cast here, including a family member of mine who will probably start appearing, and a couple of old friends, and a couple of new friends. So it won't just be me. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be alone with me all this time either. But doing my best, guys. Certainly not giving up. If anything, I'm just as thrilled. 2020 did kind of not leave me with a lot of time to do videos, but hopefully, professionally, 2021 will end up being a little slower. And with that, I can give you more time here. And so, we've worked our way up to kind of the modern era. M9A3. Yep. 19X. M17. And now we kind of come to the modern era and wrapping things up. And it seems like every time the U.S. adopts a new standard service sidearm, there's controversy. It happened in 1911 because automatics weren't as good as revolvers, people thought. Weren't durable enough, weren't safe enough. And of course it happened in 1985 with the M9. 9mm is not powerful enough. Alloy frame isn't good enough. Yada yada yada. And it happened in 2017 again. And that time it's because the Army, which was confirmed, well, the Army Air Force really, and then that was confirmed by the Navy, Marines, and even Coast Guard, went with Sig Sauer's submission of the P320, a modified version at least, over Glock's, which was a modified 19. Now, interestingly, the trials called for two guns, a full-size to replace the M9, and a compact weapon to replace the M11. And this all kind of grew out of the modular handgun program. And for years there had been talk about replacing the Beretta M9. And many insisted they would go back to 45. And when the M45A1 was selected by the Marines, people really latched onto this, saying, look, they're going back to the 1911. But in reality, not only was this probably the last 1911 variant to even see some use in production, it very well could have been the last Colt pistol. It's yet to be seen with Colt being bought by CZ, but to date it was certainly the last Colt design, and again it was a very limited production, limited purchase. No, this time the trials would be for the whole shebang. Now Beretta did offer a further update. You know, they had the where are we at here? We had the where did I put it? Here it is. Yeah, the M9A1. Well, they offered an updated version around 2015 as the M9A3, even showing conversion kits where they could just convert M9s, because the military was still receiving current contract M9s even then. And of course, they had plenty of 226s in, including updated versions like the Mark 25 with the new machined slide versus the original stamped and rolled slide. But no, they wanted to go full new trials. They didn't want the Beretta. So through 2016 they tested, and again these were the two real competitors. There were other designs submitted for sure. Now Sig Sauer, now this is Sig Sauer Inc. in New Hampshire, not Switzerland or Germany, submitted two. For the full size, they had this here, with about a 4.7 inch barrel. For the compact, they submitted similar version, but with a 3.9 inch barrel, so about 0.8 difference. Glock, on the other hand, with the 19, submitted a one-size-fits-all pistol, full-size grip, shortened barrel, becoming like the 19X. In fact, this version here is very much like what Glock submitted, except the Trials version did have a manual external safety. This is also the first 10 or FDE factory pistol Glock has ever mass produced. It was to be a 9mm but modular. Needed to have a capacity of at least 17 rounds, so on and so forth. You know, the modern features, and polymer. Well, the Sig 320 was adopted as the M17 in January of 2017. And this was confirmed a couple months later by the other branches, meaning that all branches agreed to it by the middle of that year. The Glock was not adopted. Now, some thought it should be, because the military has had Glock 19s primarily, but a few of the other variants, in its toolbox for years now. Again, as I said a minute ago, in fact, the Marines authorized some personnel to carry Glock 19s instead of the M45A1. There's a lot to be said about that, more than I want to get into here. The truth is, they went with the Sig, and that's where we're at in 2021. And they adopted the compact version as the M18. Now, interestingly, the Navy is mostly interested in the M18 to suit its needs. And that doesn't mean all older pistols are immediately out of service. In fact, the Army projects it'll take at least a decade to replace the M9 with the M17. But this is the new gun. And we have done a video comparing both of these. And I really like the Glock 19 here. It's better than a lot of the older ones, but I have to say, I do like shooting the P320 M17 more, and it is a bit more of a modular, newer design. I also get the impression that maybe Sig Sauer was hungrier for the contract. This did kind of bite him in the butt early on, especially there were some production and QC issues, but as far as I know, those have been worked out. And I will say that, you know, Chris Bartocci and I are friends, Small Arm Solution, and he has objected in the past to this gun over this one, not because he necessarily thinks the Glock is better, but because he thinks that they didn't do adequate trials and testing. I will defer to him on that because that's more of his field of expertise. I kind of know my limits, and either way, it's adopted, and initial reports seem to be pretty good. Although, interestingly, there were a batch of surplus guns that were sold off a couple of years ago that had a lot of wear and tear on them. And so, yeah. Another thing to point out, the control colors, originally with the first batches of guns shipped to the military, were FDE tan, but later guns are in the black, even for the military. Now, this is one of the commercial M17s. Not the commemoratives. I didn't really feel like paying crazy money for a commemorative, so take that as you will. And again, the Glock 19X is pretty standard production too. M45.
Had 3 rounds left in the mag.
Mark 25.
Clear.
M17. That was if I take the safety off. I always forget striker guns have safeties. And here we have the 3 main guns all lined up, showing the progression. Lots of secondary, substitute, standard guns, limited standard, special forces. But yeah, the 1911A1 served for 75 years frontline, and for still several decades afterwards second line. The Beretta still serves today, although its days are numbered, so it's going to make it at least 40 years. Maybe even bumping up on 50 if you count reserve use. And it's just beginning for the M17. We don't really know. But each time you see a major technological progression. The 1911 was a very early self-loading gun and one of the earliest to be fully durable and dependable. And at the time it fired the new 45 ACP cartridge, which, given the technology of the day, was a hard-hitting, very good round. But it was single action only, 7+1 capacity, heavy. And so by the time of the Beretta, there we go, it was time for a change. 9mm wasn't your grandpa's 9mm. It's come a long way. NATO loadings are hotter than before. And with 15+1, you have a good capacity. Double action, single action with a modern safety system, firing pin safety and what have you. And I've always liked the falling or tipping wedge system that these use because it keeps your barrel in alignment. Plus you get the alloy frame, so you're saving a lot of weight. And I've talked to several servicemen who carried these, even some that used them to defend themselves in Iraq and Afghanistan, and overall they seem to really like them. So I think it was a good choice. And yet again with the M17, we see more technological progression. We've gone fully ambidextrous, polymer frame, kind of a modular system, night sights as standard. Even higher capacity mags. This one's a 21 rounder. and modern coding technology like PVD and a rail is standard. So you can definitely see the skip up each time. And there will always be secondary guns in use. And with that, let's end by talking about the Patreon. I've mentioned it throughout this video. Really am very grateful. And because of that, a couple of things. Now that it's mostly me, I've been having to learn how to operate the Patreon page. So I apologize that it might be a little slow, but it wasn't really meant for someone who's using a text-to-speech program. But I'm getting there. That used to be something that Jay did. So I'm learning it and getting there. And to show gratitude, I am doing additional rewards. $1 and up is still asking Patreon questions. And again, I know that there should have been a Q&A a month or so back, but I will get that done. I promise you. Maybe even in the next week. And then we should resume normal Q&As again. Again, probably with a guest star each time, because I need someone to read the questions to me. So I will resume the Q&A. $1 and up, you can ask all the questions in the world you want. $5 and up is the request a video. Something that worked pretty well, and I will probably get on to that again. Jay had a few that he was working on. I guess I'll need to pick those up and do them myself. That's fine. I've also added a kind of a sneak peek there where you can see upcoming videos. I try to publish a list every couple of weeks for the $5 contributors where they can get an idea of what's coming up and also kind of give me feedback on what they'd like to see or maybe not like to see. So hopefully a little more reward there for number 5. And for the 10 and up, which is the basically immediate access, you can email me. I'll answer the questions usually within 24, sometimes 48 hours, sometimes 5 minutes, depends where I'm at. And we can even talk on the phone if you have some questions. I'm going to start doing kind of exclusive video clips and contents, behind the scenes, bloopers, more kind of off the cuff, kind of some of the stuff you see on my personal Misha channel too. So additional content, kind of more of an informal goofball thing for 10. Basically, if I'm going to embarrass myself on camera, you can at least tip the jar for the dancing monkey. I figure that's a fair enough exchange. But yeah, I'm working on it, guys. I want to acknowledge that. And I think for a lot of us, 2021 has been a lot of changes. But they don't all have to be bad. Some can be good. So that's why I wanted to give you a full video for the 4th of July. Really am working on some hopefully pretty cool new content. Some neat stuff that haven't been able to get before, and visiting some old stuff that we haven't looked at in a long time. So there might be kind of erratic publishing throughout July as we transition over to some new equipment and with some new help here. But please bear with us through the summer. We doing our very best to try to deliver a better product and whatnot. But it'll still be me here rambling about boring historical stuff. So that'll probably never change. And also, there will always be cats. There were always cats. So, with that, I appreciate you hanging out with me on the 4th here. Hope you had a good holiday, good rest. Let me know what you did. How were the fireworks? They scare my cat, so there's that. Any good cookouts? Any good times? Yeah, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And always feel free to talk about your favorite U.S. military handgun. They're pretty dang cool. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe as usual. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. I just give you an outline of the perks. So, yeah, if you're interested, go over and sign up. If you can, I really appreciate it. If you can't, I still really appreciate it. That's the point of donations. You are not obligated. Either way, thank you very much. Happy 4th of July. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.